Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited for this video where we talk about all 30 NBA teams and their cap space situations heading into this offseason. I teased this video in my most recent one, and that most recent one was all 202 NBA free agents. That's right. I went through the effort and the time to compile all 202 NBA free agents that were currently on teams that are slated to become free agents. That's about 45% of players on rosters this season. So make sure to go check out that video after this one if you're interested. Who could my team potentially look to sign? There's a lot of minimum players, exception level players, whether that's the mid-level, both the non-taxpayer and taxpayer, or you could also look at some biannual exceptions, although there's some rules with why teams don't typically use that, but sometimes there's good reason to as well, which is a lot of fun to talk about. I hope you guys do enjoy that video after this one. Also, if you are looking forward to this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, where you can see I put a lot of work and time into these videos, not only to prepare myself to talk about them for however long that video may be, but also just the effort to build graphics and daily uploads as well. So there's a lot of stuff that goes in behind the scenes that you guys typically don't see, but I have a lot of fun doing it. So let's jump into my video preview here. We're going to talk about all 30 NBA teams, their cap pictures. We're sorting that by least amount of cap space to the most. I figured building upward with teams that have more and more money is kind of a more fun, more enjoyable way to do it. We get to talk about more and more and more options instead of less and less and less. So that's the way I like to do it. Now, a lot of you might just look to skip forward to your favorite team. I'll have time cards in the description for that. But I do recommend sticking around, listening to all 30, because I do think it helps paint a picture of what teams could look to do what this offseason. We'll talk about a lot of little niche situations, specifically with the new NBA CBA that's in play. So we'll talk about that in this video, and then also maybe some potential options. Again, if you want more discussion on your favorite team, check out some of the offseason previews, or you could also request an offseason preview for your team down in the comment section below. We've had a lot of teams getting eliminated from the postseason, a lot of teams in the lottery I still have to record for as well. I'm very excited about the content that's going to be coming out on the channel. Just make sure you stay tuned for that. If you want to see your favorite team, probably will be coming out within the next couple weeks or so. So let's jump into the team with the lowest amount of cap space, and that is the Golden State Warriors. And you can see here, I'm highlighting the words practical cap space, because you're going to see that on every single graphic in today's video. What is practical cap space? To me, practical cap space is the way that I look at their cap table and the likely decisions that Golden State's going to have to make decisions on. This is true for every single team. Practical cap space is how much cap space they're going to be working with. And kind of you can guess and check some team options, and if a guy's going to opt into a player option or not. You can kind of associate some of those numbers in there. Occasionally it does account for cap holds, sometimes it does not as well. There's some reasoning behind why. I'll try my best to describe and explain why a practical cap space situation is the way that it is. But Golden State is the biggest spender in the league. They have negative $80.7 million in cap space. Now, a lot of you might be saying, what the heck? How do you have negative cap space situation? And if you look at this year's cap space number, the cap maximum is projected at $134 million for next season. So this team's already at a spot where they're projected to spend over $200 million for the roster, for the players that they have on roster. And, it's paid dividends for them. They've went far in the playoffs very frequently. They've won 4 championships in the last 8 years. They currently lead 3-2 to the Sacramento Kings at the time I'm recording this. I got to stop aging these videos, by the way, but I keep doing it. But I'm just excited. The NBA playoffs are on my mind. It's been so much fun to watch. But Golden State, looking at them long term, you might be saying, how does this team look to improve? And with the new CBA, there's not really a way for them to. It's going to be difficult to see them improving their roster. And it's going to be really pivotal for this team to continue to add players that they like through the draft, and then hoping that those players continue to develop, because that's one of the few ways that Golden State is going to be able to improve their roster year over year. They're just at a tough spot right now, negative $81 million essentially in cap space, with no options to use the taxpayer mid-level exception anymore. Biannual exceptions, really a tough way to add anybody, and for Golden State, every dollar matters, honestly, when you're this high into the tax. So over that second tax apron, it's going to be tough for them to continue to improve. So I don't really see them looking to add very much in free agency. I think the big question for them is Draymond Green What number do they get him back on if they do ultimately get him back? He's on a player option for around $27 million this year. That number is approximated into the practical cap space here, but it's possible that he opts out, maybe signs a 4-year deal with another team, or maybe a 5-year deal even with Golden State to stay there and probably finish his career in the Bay Area. Moving on to 29, we have the Los Angeles Clippers, and a lot of people on Twitter, Instagram, all over social media are calling for the Clippers to blow it up. I think that they are going to have some internal discussions about the longevity of the Kawhi and Paul George combination and how well those two players can continue to coexist with the amount of issues with missed games. But it's going to be a tough ask for them to improve outside of that because they're at negative $46.5 million, again, of practical cap space, which means it's going to be difficult to add players in with the new CBA. They're right around the number that you don't want to be around when it comes to that second tax threshold. I'm going to have a video out on the NBA CBA at some point here over the next couple of weeks as well, fully breaking down the new CBA, what it means and how it's going to actually impact teams with real examples and showing how things will work and won't work moving forward. But the Clippers right now, they're in a tough spot because they're one of the teams that's kind of getting ruined by this new CBA. And the NBA proposed the CBA the way that they did to limit teams like Golden State and the Clippers and some of these other teams that spend preposterous amounts of money to try and build a competitive team because they don't want the idea of buying championships. Now, I don't think the Clippers or the Warriors have bought championships. I really don't believe that. You could maybe make the case about Kevin Durant. That's a completely different topic because the NBA failed to smooth their cap adjustment back in the summer of 2016, which is what led to Durant signing there because all of a sudden Golden State had cap space with the year that the cap jumped and Timofey Mozgov happened, Luol Deng happened. I mean, that's not the Warriors' fault. That's the NBA's fault. So I wouldn't really make that argument against Golden State the way that others have. And for the Clippers here, I think that they're going to look internal first. They're going to see what they can do with keeping some of their own guys. They don't have a lot of guys heading towards free agency. And the nice thing is with the contracts that they have on their roster, there's a ton of middling contracts, I believe. 7 to 8 guys making between $11 to $21 million, which is very, very tradable. And in today's market, you're going to need that moving forward with the way the new CBA is structured. I think the Clippers will be just fine with the way that their front office is ran. They're very creative and smart with their cap management. I think they'll be just fine, but I don't see them having a busy offseason, at least from a signing perspective. More so likely to see them make some trades, which we will have some mock trades on the channel at some point relatively soon. 28, the Miami Heat here now, their projected practical cap space is negative $43.4 million. First of all, congratulations to Miami for moving on to the second round, being the 6th, 8th seed of all time to beat a 1 seed in a 7-game series. And Miami only needed 5 to do it. They pretty much showed out against Milwaukee and said, look, we're the better team. Now, does Giannis's injury have a little bit to do with that? Maybe, but he did look really good in that last game, 38-20, but Miami still had enough firepower. Jimmy Butler was so fantastic as well in that series. So Miami, they're feeling pretty good about themselves right now, but I think the big question for them, it's not going to be about who they look to sign and how they make a move that way. It's going to be about Kyle Lowry's contract, if they're able to find a trade partner for that and maybe upgrade their point guard position. Obviously, Damian Lillard has been attached in some rumors to Miami before. I think that's something that I would not rule out at this point based on my intel. But anything can happen in the offseason. I'm not guaranteeing a Damian Lillard trade to Miami or anything like that. I think that Portland's preferred scenario right now is still keeping Damian Lillard and building around him. But things can change quickly in the NBA if you're catching my drift here. Moving on to 27, the Denver Nuggets at negative $36.65 million. And this is a really important number because of that new second threshold in the luxury tax where Denver's actually pretty close to that number. Now, the big thing for them is they do have their guys locked in for the most part. Michael Porter Jr., Jamal Murray, Nikola Jokic, all under contract, of course, going into next season. And I think Denver, for them, it's going to be really difficult for this team to continue to find bench pieces that can help flush out this team's depth. I think that they are rather thin as of right now, but their top 5 is very, very good and they fit together very well. I think for Denver, the one big issue I have with them long-term is outside of Christian Brown, who they drafted this year, who else do you see sticking around as a Denver Nugget the next 5 years? outside of their starting lineup. And I know that's kind of a difficult thing to ask. Now, I'm kind of nitpicking here a little bit, but they don't have a lot of ways to continue to improve. I think that it's going to be very imperative for them to make smart minimum signings and get a lot out of those players. And they're also going to have to be creative in some of the trades that they make. But they do currently already owe some draft picks out the door for some of their previous transactions as well. So Denver, no pick this year. I don't think they have a pick in 2025 because of the Aaron Gordon trade. So they'll have to be creative in trying to improve their roster. Probably see some second round picks being dealt out of Denver at some point, trying to bring in some depth pieces. They did a nice job using their taxpayer mid-level last year for Bruce Brown, but he did have a player option on that, so he's headed toward free agency again this offseason, probably finds a new team to play with. So I think Denver's going to have some challenges ahead of them, but I think they'll do a pretty decent job filling in with some of those players with some minimums or some draft picks down the road. 26, Atlanta, negative $33.53 million. Fifth highest payroll going into next season for what's currently on their roster. Of course, when you make a trade for DeJounte Murray, I think the big question for them is how do they keep DeJounte Murray, because he's not on a contract that they can really extend, even with the new NBA CBA extension rules at 140%. There's just no way he's going to sign for that. I think he's going to look for a max contract. Some team might give it to him. Not talking the super max here, I'm just talking full max, normal, normal standard max. And I think for Atlanta, you have to look at yourself in the mirror and say, are we going to be the team that's going to pay DeJounte Murray that contract? And I know a lot of fans right now are probably saying, obviously they are. They traded so much to get him. Remember, they've had a GM change since trading for DeJounte Murray just a few months ago. Landry Fields is now the GM. There's no, oh, hey, I made this decision, I got to stand by it and double down on it. The Hawks are going to look at everything fairly objectively, and they'll have a big question to make. But this offseason, I don't see them being big players out in free agency. In fact, I think the draft's really their best avenue to adding a shooter and trying to kind of run this thing back next year, but retrofit a little bit with a little bit more wing talent, a little bit more movement shooting, and just natural spacing around their front court and DeJounte Murray. Number 25, the Philadelphia 76ers here now, and you can see this number right here below is a very, very important number. Negative $27.8 million is the projected cap space for Philadelphia next season, and that is with James Harden's current numbers included into that. Going into next year, James Harden, we'll see, he could be a big-time flight risk. We'll talk about him later in this video, and if you're a fan of a certain team, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. But Philadelphia, the reason that number right there, negative $27.8 million, is so important, there is a $28 million difference between the luxury tax threshold and the salary cap maximum threshold. That $28 million is massively important here for a team like Philadelphia, who this year we saw them duck under the tax after trading Matisse Thybulle away and bringing in Jalen McDaniels. They wanted to get under the tax. Now with the new CBA, the tax is less punitive than it typically has been, but there is still punishment for being in the tax compared to not in it. So Philadelphia, a big question here is, are they going to be willing to spend again this offseason and try and continue to add to their roster? And then what does a potential Harden extension look like? Does that push them significantly over that negative $28 million mark, which puts them into the tax for good? Now, don't get me wrong, their ownership can afford it. They just bought the Washington Commanders. So cash flow is at an all-time maximum there in Philadelphia. A lot of money going out, but I'm sure a lot of money is probably coming back in through some of the sources that they have. And, a partnership with Magic Johnson always helps. They've got a lot of money there. I'm not trying to, bail out these owners and say, oh, they don't have the money. They do. They do have the money. But this second round is going to be important too in kind of convincing ownership that, hey, this is a team that could potentially win it all. And I think that's going to be a big question for Philadelphia. Last year was their year to be active. We saw that with Daniil House on the biannual. We saw that with PJ Tucker as well. Philadelphia is very, very interested in competing and winning for titles, but I think it's all going to come down to James Harden this offseason and if he decides to stay in town or not. 24, the Milwaukee Bucks here, negative $27.73 million. Roughly the same cap picture, although they have everyone locked in. On contracts, besides Chris Middleton, he has a player option. My expectation is he will opt into that. But he did have a pretty nice final game 5 where he scored over 30 points in that one. And maybe it's his last little hurrah effort. in a Milwaukee Bucks uniform. I'm not going to say he's for sure gone, but I think it's going to take a pretty penny to lock him in Milwaukee. I'm not sure if they're going to be willing to do that, just based on how the last year and a half has really gone with him, missing a lot of time, and ultimately Milwaukee landing in a spot where they're not very happy. A first-round exit as the 1 seed, definitely a tough spot to be in. And then you also look at some of the other free agents that they're potentially losing. Javon Carter, Jay Crowder, Joe Ingles, just to name a few. Brook Lopez is also up for free agency. I think Milwaukee's got one of the more complicated cap space situations this offseason, because with all those cap holds, there's a lot of players they would love to keep and are vitally important for them winning. Middleton and Brook Lopez, of course, at the top of that list, but Ingles, Crowder both had pretty nice moments this year for Milwaukee in shorter periods of time, shorter minutes. But Javon Carter also had a 30-plus point game this year, and not just that one game matters, but Javon Carter's a nice tempo pusher for them. They have a lot of guys that I think they'd like to keep, but they have to look at themselves in the mirror and ask, okay, are we going to go into the tax for this team? And if we do go into the tax, are we going to be willing to go into the second tax threshold, which is a really, again, punitive level of contract situation to get into? And then for Milwaukee, are they going to be good enough with those guys? Because, again, yes, Giannis got hurt and drastically changes the series, him missing basically 2.5 games. But even when he was out there, they just did not look better than the Miami Heat. And that's a big red flag, and might strike ownership and management there as we need to make some changes. So we'll see. I think Milwaukee's an interesting team to keep our eye on this offseason. We'll see what they look to do with their cap situation. The Boston Celtics here now, negative $27 million as well. I think the big thing for them, Danilo Gallinari has a player option. Grant Williams is headed towards restricted free agency. They'll have to make some decisions on those players. I think the easiest thing to predict here, Boston probably stays out of tax hell and just passes on Grant Williams in restricted free agency. My guess is some other team will sign him to an offer sheet with the new CBA rules as well. It feels like I'm saying that every other sentence, but that's how important it is. Grant Williams probably does get to just flat out sign with the other team, and Boston probably does not match. So Grant Williams probably on his way out. Celtics fans are going to say, who cares? Barely play him anyway, which is somewhat true. But still, anytime you lose a wing for essentially nothing, it hurts. So I think ultimately for Boston, if they can just look to keep most of the gang together, I mean, they're a really good team. They probably should be viewed as the favorite in the East as of right now, to go to the finals at least. I think they're in a really strong spot, and Joe Mazzulla is a great head coach. Tatum and Brown are really the transcendent players. Brown's also got an interesting contract situation right now. If he makes All-NBA, he's eligible for the Supermax, which Boston would almost certainly give him. So that's another big thing to watch for the cap space situation. But Boston right now, they're in a pretty solid spot. Grant Williams is really the only big flight risk, which I think they'd be okay with. 22, the Washington Wizards. And this is where the video starts to get a little bit more fun. We get to some of these teams like Washington, who I have a video or an offseason video out on, kind of covering how they're in a really weird spot. I think the Wizards are a team that's negative $18.55 million in practical cap space. I'm going to tell you right now, I think both Porzingis and Kuzma are opting out of their player options, which you would theoretically think, oh, maybe that opens up some money for Washington. No, it does not, because the Wizards are going to try their hardest to keep Kyle Kuzma, and it's going to take a lot of money. Kyle Kuzma had a very nice season for them. Now, does he impact winning to the highest extent? Is he the player that they should lock in on? I don't think so, but it's really, really hard for a new GM to walk into a job and say, oh, by the way, the guy that scored 22 points a game last year, we're just not going to keep him. That seems like a really, really tough decision to make on day one of a new job, and I think ultimately Washington's going to commit to him. They might commit to Porzingis. We'll see. I think Porzingis possibly leaves, though, in free agency. One of the bigger names out on the market this offseason, which I'm very excited for him to have a potential chance out in free agency to go to a team that wants him and really values him. But Washington, negative $18.5 million. It might sound better than it looks, but it's really not a great situation for them. I think they're in a very, very tough spot moving forward. 21, the Phoenix Suns here, negative $18 million. And that might seem surprisingly open for the Suns to have that much quote-unquote cap space where they're not that far over compared to some of these other teams. But the issue is they have really only 4 guys that you trust. They have a whole bunch of guys headed toward free agency. Some key players, Josh Okogie is, I think, a good example of that. Bismack Biyombo, who I'm sure they'll keep somewhat around the minimum or maybe a little bit higher. For them, it's going to be really important to hit on some of their signing, some of the guys that they keep at the minimum level price point. And because they're going to need these guys to be the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th best players on their team, just with how their team's currently constructed, I think that they're in a tough spot to continue to get better. Now, I think we will see them use the taxpayer mid-level exception. Almost certainly, I'd be shocked if we don't see that with Matt Ishbia as their new owner. So Phoenix, I think, is in a solid spot. Of course, you have the big four. I think one big thing to watch for them, this is a little bit of an under-the-radar news that I don't think is being reported on very much. I think that the point guard position is a question mark in Phoenix long term. I know Monty Williams loves Chris Paul, but Russell Westbrook, Kyrie Irving are two potential options there in Phoenix. More so Kyrie than Russ, but if the price makes sense for Russ, I don't think the Suns would fully rule it out, if you're catching my drift here. 20, the New Orleans Pelicans, they have negative $17 million in cap space or so, kind of right in that ballpark. And for New Orleans, they have their young guys locked in. The reason why their cap space looks the way that it does is Zion Williamson's contract is on the brink of kicking in. And with their long-term outlook on how do they continue to improve this team, they're very similar to the Clippers in terms of their movable, tradable contracts. Jonas Valanciunas, Larry Nance kind of fit into that a little bit. They have all these other draft picks that they could attach into a deal. I think New Orleans is actually very well aligned to make another big move that nobody's expecting. Now, are we going to see them actually pull the trigger on something? Of course, they were tied to Kevin Durant for the longest time. I think that there's going to be some rumors about Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby potentially to New Orleans. For me, I think New Orleans needs to get it right if they ultimately do pull a trigger on a big move, but free agency is going to be less about New Orleans, but the trade market's really where this team's going to be able to thrive. 19, the Brooklyn Nets, negative $10 million in practical cap space, and a big question for them is how do they look to reinvigorate this roster? How do they reshape this roster? And what happens with Ben Simmons? If I was a team right now, not the Brooklyn Nets, I would be looking at Ben Simmons as a potential addition. Now, I know that might sound crazy. I know Ben Simmons has had a really, really poor past 24 months of NBA basketball, but, and I'm not even buying on the upside anymore. I'm just saying you look at the numbers. If you can get incentivized to take in his contract, it's a really, really good way to add assets, and you're not even getting in this like tumultuous 5-year contract like what Bradley Beal's on right now. It's a completely different contract. Everyone loves to talk about contracts and, oh, this contract's the worst in the league. And to be honest, that should go to Bradley Beal. I've said that multiple times in videos before. Bradley Beal's got a worse contract right now than Ben Simmons, but people don't know it yet. People don't realize it. And the thing is, Ben Simmons' contract is coming to a point where it's getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and it's not that far from expiration. So if you can get an asset for that, pretty valuable. Plus that upside I do think is semi there, but that's not the reason why I would necessarily look into making that move if I was another team. And Brooklyn, I think they would be a team that could look to buy Karl Anthony Towns level player, or, you know, of course, Damian Lillard's been linked to this team. There's been a lot of rumors. I think Brooklyn's going to look to be active, but we'll see if they can actually figure out a deal and then also then pull the trigger on that deal. The execution is always so much more difficult than the planning of a deal like that. 18, the Toronto Raptors, negative $6 million. The one issue I have with Toronto, though, with their cap space, they have cap holds out on some guys, of course. Right now, their cap picture doesn't look so bad because Scotty Barnes is playing on his rookie deal, but they don't have a lot of depth. Otto Porter Jr. opted into his player option, and Toronto, with what they're at right now, they've got 3 guys that are likely going to be free agents. Jakob Poeltl, and not just 3 guys, 3 starting level players. Jakob Poeltl, Gary Trent, Fred VanVleet. My guess is they lose at least one of them, probably 2 of them. Jakob Poeltl is the only one I really see being a lock to be back in Toronto. Now, if I had to take a guess, the second most likely to return would be Gary Trent Jr. I have a really strong indication that Fred VanVleet is going to be playing in a different market next year. That's not fully reporting. That's not me saying 100% without a doubt. I just have a strong inkling that he will not be back with the Toronto Raptors. Anything's possible. I could see them trying to work something out with him, but I feel like this situation is going to play out somewhat similar to how Kyle Lowry's did before he ultimately went to Miami, except the only difference is VanVleet's significantly younger than Lowry was at the time. I think he'll be a much better signing for whatever team looks to add him. And this summer, there's a lot of cap space out there for a lot of teams looking to get better and improve to their team, and also just add some good veterans around a young core, I think Van Vliet's a really good option out there. So I think Toronto probably loses at least one of those three guys I mentioned. And with Jakob Poeltl being recently traded for, like, yes, obviously it's imperative then Toronto keeps him. Do you not think his agent understands that and says, oh, well, interesting. They just traded a first rounder that they still owe next year for my client. Yeah, we're going to play a little bit of hardball here, and we're going to make sure that my guy gets paid. I think Jakob Poeltl is going to sign an above-market contract with Toronto, and I think they're going to hamstring themselves a little bit long-term. And it's going to be one of the few mistakes I think Masai Ujiri's made in his time as an executive with the Raptors. 17, the Memphis Grizzlies projected negative $6.1 million, and this playoffs maybe has helped their cap space table a little bit because Dillon Brooks has significantly lost a lot of money this postseason with the way he's played against the Los Angeles Lakers, the way that they've been guarding him, the way that he's guarded LeBron at times has been good, and at times it's been, if we can't really use him to guard LeBron, what's he even out on the court for? I think the Grizzlies are really going to snoop around a big trade. They have the Golden State Warriors 2024 first-round pick. They have all of their own picks, and it's something typically Zach Kleiman has not looked to do so far in his time as GM and decision maker for the Memphis Grizzlies. I think now is the time. I think he's going to really explore deals out there on the market to improve this team, specifically starting at the wing position. A guy like Mikal Bridges comes to mind. I also know that they had at least offered 3 first-round picks for OG Anunoby in a trade offered to the Toronto Raptors this past trade deadline. The Grizzlies want to improve. They want to get better on the wing. They wanted to improve over Dillon Brooks before this year's playoffs. That opportunity did not come up to them, and now they find themselves in a spot where they're going to massively hunt that type of upgrade this offseason. 16, the New York Knicks here, negative $5.15 million in cap space. Their number one priority is Josh Hart. He is on a player option, but if he opts in, it becomes non-guaranteed, so he'll almost certainly opt out. He'll work out a brand new deal using his bird rights with the New York Knicks, and he will be in New York for a long time, at least 3-4 years, because the Knicks really like him. He really likes playing with the Knicks, with Jalen Brunson, again, his former college teammate. I think that's really priority number one for the Knicks, and then priority number 2 becomes, okay, what stars are available? This team is best equipped to go out after a star. They're right there with the best of the teams in the league when it comes to ability to maybe persuade and pursue a star player. And now this is the first time I've been saying this on the channel because it's different than when it was 3, 4, 5 years ago and they were begging for a star to come. They are well positioned. They are well aligned to actually attract a star player to play alongside Jalen Brunson, Julius Randle, Mitchell Robinson. They've got the young players to attach in a deal. Emmanuel Quickly, Obi Toppin, of course, their 2 names have always been floated out there. But they've got the stuff that you need. They've got a bad contract they could attach. They are very well set up to make some noise, not only right now with a chance to maybe go to the conference finals, but they're very well set up for the next 2, 3, 4 years to explore trade possibilities, add to their roster, and maybe make a push to become a finals contender at some point very soon. 15, the Minnesota Timberwolves here now, and this is where we get to the spot with positive cap space in terms of practical cap space. The only issue, though, is at $7 million in cap space, you really don't have money to actually do anything. Yes, you could sign one player on like a 2-year, $14 million deal. That's just not really the way the NBA works, though. You don't get players on that type of contract value that give you big plus upside. Yes, that's the non-taxpayer mid-level. Could you technically, theoretically use that type of money to bring in a Joe Ingles? Yes. But Minnesota's not going to be in the market to do so. They're going to be more worried about retaining first Naz Reid, who had a fantastic season for them. Secondly, they're going to be more interested after Naz Reid in prioritizing Jalen Noel in free agency. He had a down year, so that should help them in contract negotiations, keep him long term. We'll see if they're able to get that done. But those are the 2 top priorities for Minnesota when it comes to the free agency landscape. And then after that point, for ways to improve, it's really going to be focused on what can they get for certain players. I don't want to name drop anybody, but there's a 7-footer on their roster that they might look to move. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to, but that's been heavily speculated about, and I'm going to tell you that I do have understanding that that could be a potential option for them. Again, I don't think a deal gets done. I think that they're going to take the slow approach here about, hey, we haven't really seen our core play together that much. Cat missed a ton of time. Gobert missed a decent amount of games this year compared to how much he usually, compared to his usual availability. We also just recently brought in Mike Conley, who is fantastic for them. I think Minnesota's going to slow play this offseason. They're going to prioritize keeping the players that help them and hoping to continue to build together through camaraderie and chemistry and consistency. But it's going to be a difficult offseason for them to not really go out and add any talent. 14, the Chicago Bulls here now, $8 million in cap space, find themselves in a very similar spot to Minnesota, but instead of it being Naz Reid, it's Nikola Vucevic, who is out there in free agency. And Chicago, this is a big pivot offseason for them, because if they commit to Vucevic, I think they're committing to mediocrity. But if they don't keep Vucevic, then they have DeRozan and LaVine, and they're probably still not that good. So there's really no great outcome here for Chicago in my eyes. I think, to be honest, I feel really bad for Bulls fans specifically, because I do think that they're missing pieces literally on their roster. Lonzo Ball would help this team so much. His defensive versatility, athleticism, length, size is so important for a team that really, really needs it. I think he's really the best connector this team could have found, both offensively and defensively, plus his three-point shot making, which was reaching all-time highs before his injury over a year ago now. Just the fact that he's a big question mark about if he's ever going to play in the NBA again, I think is a massive disaster for the Bulls, and just a really tough change of events for a team that was playing so well before Lonzo's injury and before Caruso's injuries. It's a bummer for them, because they're just never going to get back to that level in my eyes. And I think the Bulls are in a really tough spot, kind of out of their own control though. 13, the Cleveland Cavaliers here now, and we're starting to get a little bit higher in cap space number, but still $12.77 million in practical cap space is not enough money to really go out and make any noise. The reason that they even have this much is because Evan Mobley's on his rookie deal, and this is not accounting for any Karis LeVert money, which I think, yes, I know Karis LeVert really up and down this year. I'm not the highest person myself on Karis LeVert, but for Cleveland, he's almost a must keep. And the reason why they have to sign Karis LeVert right now is to trade him later. With the new CBA, the way that things are going to be structured, if Cleveland loses Karis LeVert, it will be very, very difficult for them to make up any type of money in a trade. And they still have second-round picks. I know people are going to be saying, well, they don't even have their first-round picks anyways. Why should they value trade value and flexibility? It's because at some point, some of those first-round picks will regenerate, repopulate into their stash. As drafts pass, that means you have access to more draft picks going forward. And Karis LeVert at $15 million might not be the best contract, but it's movable. And that's really the most important thing. If you're attaching 2 or 3 second-round picks to Karis LeVert, could you get a decent player? Probably. And that might be the way that they try and figure out the small forward position long-term. Listen to me. I hated the Karis LeVert trade when they made it. I thought that they way overpaid for a guy. They owe their draft pick this year for Karis LeVert. It's a complete nightmare disaster. Okay, it was just not good for them when they made that deal. I understand that they had needs at the time. For a guy like Karis LeVert, it was an overpay. They shouldn't have done that trade. It obviously is all worked out a little bit. Now they got bounced by the Knicks, so I don't think it's worked out great, but they're not in a terrible situation. They were still able to bring in Donovan Mitchell. They have 4 good players on their roster, but the issue for Cleveland is they need 6 or 7 good players on their roster to really make some noise, I think. And until they get there, I just think it's going to be kind of bare bones in the postseason for this team finding success. Number 12, the Portland Trailblazers, $13.425 million in practical cap space. Don't let that number fool you, though. You might as well write negative infinity next to the Portland Trailblazers for cap space, because they are going to lock in on Jeremy Grant. And it's going to be one of the biggest overpays we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years in free agency. They're going to give him way too much money. I'm already deathly afraid of it. One of the biggest overpays in last year's offseason was Jusuf Nurkic. I think a good definition for Blazers mismanagement and Blazers front office failures in the last decade and a half has been retaining their own players. You think about the Allen Crabbe re-signing. You think about Jusuf Nurkic, his new contract that they gave him. The list goes on. There's a lot of players that right now I'm not able to name off the top of my head. Al-Farouq Aminu comes to mind. The Blazers have paid a lot of guys, and usually it has not panned out that well outside of Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum. Yusuf Nurkic, yes, he was a pretty solid center for them for a while, but they chose the wrong time to extend him. The Blazers right now, I think, are really in a tough spot. I think they're going to commit to trying to win around Dame. I think that they even look into a Simons trade possibly. We'll see if something like that comes to fruition or not. I think winning the lottery would go a long way in helping this team climb out of their current situation. You could say that about any team in the NBA, basically, but I think Portland, if they commit to Jeremy Grant, they're doomed, honestly. Number 11, the Dallas Mavericks. Talking about doomed, this is my favorite team, the Dallas Mavericks, and honestly, if you guys remember, if you were here for my trade deadline live stream, I said it was an F trading for Kyrie Irving, and you might be saying, well, look at that. Now they have $22 million in cap space. No, they really do not, because Kyrie Irving's an unrestricted free agency, and with his cap hold and likely re-signing him on a max level deal, not sure about max years, but I know it will be 100% max money. The Mavericks are going to commit to him, and they're still going to have the same flaws that they've always had: rim protection, rebounding, flexible perimeter defensive upside. They just don't have those three things, and those are the three things you need to be a championship team. People are going to blame Luka. People on Instagram and Twitter are going to say, oh, well, Luka, you can't win with that style of play. It has nothing to do with the style of play. It has everything to do with the fact that they can't rebound the ball. They can't block any shots around the rim, and teams know it. Teams just attack them and say, okay, let's see if Dwight Powell is going to challenge us at the rim. The answer to that is no. The Dallas Mavericks, I've been harsh on other teams in this video. I'm going to be harsh on them too. I said it when they traded for Kyrie Irving. They are continuing to crawl closer to losing Luka Doncic. The only bright side about this Mavericks roster right now, they have Luka Doncic, and if he ever requested a trade, they would get a mother load for him. That's really the big positive. Otherwise, everything else has been terribly mismanaged. Nico Harrison has done a terrible job, in my opinion, of course, making the Western Conference Finals. Congratulations. But I just think that there's a lot of flaws to the way that they've gone about building their team. I've constantly equated it to trying to build a team like you're playing NBA 2K, where you just try and get as many 90 overall players as you can and say, oh, we have star A plus star B plus whatever. That's not how the NBA works. Okay, you need shot blocking, you need rebounding, you need size, you need length, you need athleticism, something the Mavericks don't really have a lot of. Now they do have a pathway to actually having this cap space by renouncing rights to Christian Wood, which they will do. And then also, if they lose Kyrie Irving, you could look at them potentially bringing in some players, but again, you're going to have a lot of the same flaws. And then if that's the case, if that's the actual route that they go by losing Kyrie Irving, moving off of Wood, you've essentially traded a first rounder for Wood, who played for a year for you. And then you also traded a first rounder that you're going to owe unprotected in 2029 for 22 games of Kyrie Irving. Seems like a questionable decision, if you ask me. Number 10, the Sacramento Kings here. This team also owes a draft pick in 2024, and this cap space is kind of pseudo cap space as well, $23 million. They are going to be focused on retaining Harrison Barnes first, and then also their next matter of business would be attending to a Domantas Sabonis extension. So I don't really see the Kings being active in free agency. Now, the one big thing for them is they do have, a non-taxpayer mid-level exception. They can go out and add a player for around $12 million a year, which I think would really help this team, specifically looking for another wing player. I think that they're just, a day late and a dollar short when it comes to wing depth. Keegan Murray progressing will continue to help alleviate that, but just as a rookie, their reliance on him in the first round of the playoffs here has been pretty evident that, at moments he'll give you some really good stuff. He had a really nice rookie season, a brilliant rookie season, I would even say, but just having one more option would have been really, really nice for them this year. They did poke around in the trade block during the deadline, and they just didn't land on anything they really, really liked or were willing to give up assets for, which is fine. I think them being patient was good. You're just not basing everything off of 1 year, but cap space for them this offseason is not really a big likelihood that they improve greatly that way, but I do think that they could add, some small marginal pieces that do help them take some of those next steps forward as an organization. Number 9, this is when we get into the teams with real serious cap space that can actually go out and make some moves. Indiana was one of the biggest, most important teams last offseason because we saw them sign DeAndre Ayton to an offer sheet. They find themselves now in a spot with $28.02 million. The likelihood of being able to go out make some big signing, it's there. That the likelihood, the possibility of that is serious. Now, do I think that they're going to maybe spend it all in one place? No, we might see them break it up into one guy around that 1 year or, $18 million a year type of price range. Not something that's going to absolutely break the bank, but is going to be a nice addition for them. We talk about Sacramento needing some more wings. Indiana is really desperate for wing play right now. And if they could add a few lengthy, athletic players on the perimeter who can also shoot the basketball, those are, all the things every team's looking for. Indiana would be really, really in a good spot because I like their center in Miles Turner. I like their combination of Tyrese Halliburton and Buddy Hield. Buddy Hield is really amplified by Halliburton and his ability as a passer. But then also Benedict Mathurin, I think, is an underrated player and a guy who I know people are kind of starting to fall out on a little bit. Does he have deficiencies? 100% he does. When it comes to driving the basketball, he basically shuts his eyes because he's not going to read the floor. That's okay. He's a rookie. Give him some time. I think he's going to develop. I think his perimeter shot making is going to take a step forward in year 2 as well. Benedict Mathurin is going to be a really good player in the league. And I think Indiana's going to continue adding good pieces on this roster. And with the cap space that they have, plus a mid-level exception, we could see them take a serious jump forward going into next season. 8th, we have the Los Angeles Lakers, and this practical cap space is kind of misleading. No, they're not going to have money for a max contract or so, I think. Now, with Rob Pelinka, you never really know because all the things that he should do, half the time he doesn't do. For example, he trades all of his depth and all of his good players and a draft pick for Russell Westbrook when I knew that it was a terrible decision at the time. And, everyone's going to say, oh, everyone knew that. If you go back and you watch some old videos from big channels, big YouTube channels, I'm telling you, they're going to say, well, I kind of like this for the Lakers. It gives them a secondary ball handler for when LeBron, that's what they all said. They all said it. You can go back and watch. Go watch some big giant YouTuber. They didn't know what they were talking about, okay? And Rob Pelinka didn't know what he was doing. He listened to LeBron James' guidance, and that was just terribly wrong. The Lakers now finally have a basketball team. And listen, I'm not low on Russ. I think Russ is a very good basketball player, but I just think it's the perfect example of how fit and meshing play styles is really, really important in basketball. And honestly, the most underrated element when it comes to basketball discussion. Everyone loves to rank players and say, oh, 1 through 50, here's my best guys. Yes, that's fun to do. But just because you have 3 guys in the top 50 doesn't mean you're going to win. You need to have some of that top talent, but you also need to have guys who are congruent parts that work together. Like I talked about with Buddy Hield and Tyrese Halliburton. I think those two are a really good combination. I think that LeBron and AD are a good combination, and I would really prefer for the Lakers to just keep some of their pieces, maybe look to continue to add some more depth and kind of flush out the roster with some of the things they're missing. I think another backup big man who can protect the rim for the duration of the regular season would be really important for them. I also think they do need a little bit more influx of playmaking outside of LeBron, but that has to be like a secondary, tertiary priority. It can't be some big trade for a non-shooter. It can't be something like that. Yes, Kyrie Irving's extremely talented, but I'm telling you, if they make the Kyrie Irving decision, it's going to be a bad situation because it's not going to be quite as bad as Russ because the fit's a little bit clearer and more obvious. The skill sets align a little bit better, but the Lakers would not be better than they currently are right now, honestly, because LeBron's going to be a year older, AD's going to be a year older, Kyrie's going to be a year older, and then they'd go back to having about 8 or 9 guys on minimum contracts, which just really does not work well. Their priority should be Austin Reeves first, figuring out what to do with the rest of the roster after that. 7, the Charlotte Hornets here now, $31.4 million. We'll see what happens with Miles Bridges. I think he's a very unique, different topic of discussion that kind of plays himself into this video a little bit. But for me with Charlotte, I think that they're going to look to add wings as well. This is a free agent period where wing players are going to be very valued like they always are, and they're going to be hard to get. But I think Charlotte, Indiana are going to be 2 teams that are competing for wings and at least trying to set themselves up to land 1, if not 2, just solid veteran role-playing wing players to put around some of their star guards, whether that's Halliburton or whether that's LaMelo Ball. I think the Hornets, pretty much everything I said about the Pacers is semi-true for the Hornets, although I'm a little bit lower on their future, assuming they don't get the first overall pick. just because I prefer Halliburton over LaMelo a little bit. I also prefer Turner over Mark Williams just slightly because Williams is younger, a little bit less proven at this point. And I think the Hornets have less good players around those guys than what the Pacers have. But, you know, I think they're in similar spots. I just think the Pacers are maybe just a little bit further ahead in terms of age and also just some of the talent on the roster. 6, the Detroit Pistons here. Shout out to my Pistons viewers if you guys are watching right now. Make sure to leave a like. Pistons fans, I know you guys are crazy diehards about the Pistons, so let's get some Pistons hype in the chat down below. And $37 million. Last offseason, I had talked about how Troy Weaver was aligned to do really, really good things with cap space had he chosen to take that route, and then he decided to not do that. And in fact, with the New York Knicks, facilitated a trade to take in Nerlens Noel and Alec Burks, add some veterans, add some draft compensation and assets moving forward, help them kind of open the door to getting Jalen Duren, obviously, which was a very nice move for them. I love Jalen Duren as a player. But I also said right after all of that was done that they pushed their cap space back a year, which there was nothing wrong about that. It changed which year they would look to potentially be buyers. Could the Pistons do something like that again? Yes, Troy Weaver has shown a willingness to take in money, to take in contracts to add more draft compensation and give himself more swings in the draft. Do I think that's a good option for Detroit? 100%. But I also think that they are at a spot where they have a lot of really young guys, and it's very, very difficult to win in the NBA with a lot of young players. And with the idea that, hey, new coach, Cade Cunningham's coming back healthy, I think this team should really prioritize trying to take a step forward when it comes to winning and winning now. And I think that the best way to do that is adding through free agency. There's some really good players out in free agency. Again, check my free agency video for potential options for Detroit, but I think there's some players out there who could give them some of the things they're lacking. Again, wing play. I feel like I have to keep saying it because all of these teams that aren't that good right now and have a lot of cap space to spend need wings. And I think Detroit's a team that really fits into that as well. Number 5, the Oklahoma City Thunder. They have $37.3 million in practical cap space, but I don't think that they should go out and spend it. In fact, with the amount of players that they have, I think that they should maybe look at adding 1 or 2 guys in free agency, budgeting out their money that way, and potentially even adding a 3rd guy if they could, kind of all on that non-taxpayer mid-level exception type contract of around $12 million a year. You could clearly fit 3 guys into that. That $36 million mark would fit right into their cap space window. It gives you movable, tradable contracts, which I think will be important for OKC with the new CBA. They're going to have to figure out ways to continue to make trades because Sam Presti, when he has flexibility and leverage in trade discussions, he seemingly does a very good job for the most part, unless it's around James Harden, then he does terribly. But outside of that, I mean, he's got a very good track record when it comes to trades and decision making. And I think he's going to continue to look to build that way. So I think he should amplify his roster right now, add some decent wing talent and maybe even a backup big to work with Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams, who I really like. Talking about Arkansas Jalen Williams, the big man. Obviously, J-Dub, the wing, is very good as well. I just think add a few more pieces in, help this team take a couple steps forward, give them some veteran leadership and guidance, give them some players who can go out and make some plays, but also reopen some of that trade flexibility by giving you contracts that are movable. Number 4, the Utah Jazz here now. And for a team that, you know, Danny Ainge talking about master traders, he's right in that discussion as well. $41.25 million. I think their first order of business is probably keeping Jordan Clarkson. The ownership group in Utah really, really loves Clarkson, wants him to be a part of their organization long term. I do think he's going to have a lot of suitors, though, out in free agency after a career year moving into the starting lineup for what was a pretty competitive Utah Jazz team. I think the Jazz are going to want to keep him, and then from there, they're going to probably take a stab or 2 at some guys, whether they're restricted free agents. I think a really obvious example of a guy that they would love to add is Grant Williams. Danny Ainge himself is the person who drafted Grant Williams. I would be kind of shocked to see Grant Williams take an offer from any other team other than the Utah Jazz, just with how money's aligned. I really, really like that destination in free agency for both the Jazz landing Grant Williams and also for Grant Williams progressing his career and getting a greater opportunity elsewhere. 3, the San Antonio Spurs. Maybe not the most attractive market in terms of past free agency signings, but they have gotten the job done and closed the door on some deals. One really notable one, LaMarcus Aldridge. back quite a few years ago. And I think the Spurs, with $46.5 million, very good odds to land the top number 1 pick or potentially a top 2, top 3 pick in a pretty loaded draft class. The Spurs are going to be in a pretty good spot to make some noise and potentially bring in a high-end player through free agency. Kyrie Irving, talk about a sleeper destination. Remember, Kyrie Irving wanted to play for Greg Popovich back in 2017 after requesting a trade from the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cavs did not grant that trade request to the Spurs and in fact sent him to Boston instead. But San Antonio, I think, would be a sleeper destination for a few different players. Now, Spurs fans might be saying, no, we're good on Kyrie Irving, and I completely understand that, but the talent's there. The need at that position is there. A score would really help kind of alleviate the roles and duties for some of these other players on their team and kind of fit them back into their natural spots. And let's say San Antonio did move up to number 1, Victor Wembanyama plus Kyrie Irving has a pretty good way to improve your team pretty quickly. But again, that's speculation at this point. Again, I don't have any firm reporting that Kyrie Irving's looking at the Spurs seriously as of right now, but I've seen crazier things happen in the NBA. Number 2, the Orlando Magic, second most cap space this offseason at nearly $50 million. And I talked about Fred VanVleet a lot earlier with the Toronto Raptors and how I think he's dashing in free agency. I think the Phoenix Suns are a serious option for Fred VanVleet, but I think another really, really serious place that would consider adding VanVleet to their current core, the Orlando Magic. I think they would really love to add VanVleet as a veteran to their roster to help them take a step forward. Now, Markelle Fultz played very, very well down the stretch of the season. I think he's starting to regain some of the form that we saw back at the University of Washington when he garnered first overall pick type of love and serious consideration pretty much across all scouting platforms as the consensus number 1 pick in that year's draft. I myself was a little bit lower on him, but I was also not at the spot yet where I was recording on YouTube, and I wasn't where I am now. So, you can take me at face value for that or not. I've had no issues admitting when I've been wrong before in the past. I didn't like Trae Young that much in his own draft. So I'm not just trying to blow smoke here. I just seriously did not like Markelle Fultz as much as everybody else did, but he has played pretty well in an Orlando uniform, specifically when healthy. But I do think Orlando would just like to add more talent, specifically backcourt talent to their team. And I think a guy like Fred VanVleet could really help them take the next step forward, give them a little bit more offensive punch while also not sacrificing some of their defensive capabilities that they already have showcased early in the career of Paulo Banchero, Franz Wagner, and some of those young guys. Then the team with the most cap space, the Houston Rockets. And this is going to be the summer of the Houston Rockets in my eyes. $64.17 million, a likely chance at drafting Brandon Miller or Victor Wembanyama. Either of those two would suffice what Houston would need next to the guy on the screen, James Harden. I think Harden returns to Houston this offseason. I think he is destined for a reunion with the organization. Now, am I completely ruling out Philadelphia? It maybe sounds like I am. I'm not. Harden's going to either be playing for the Rockets or the Sixers next year. If you pulled me right now and gave me a truth serum and you asked me who do I really think he's going to be playing for, my honest to God answer is the Houston Rockets. Initially, I didn't feel that way, but as time has progressed, my indicators are pointing more and more and more towards the Houston Rockets. And anytime James Harden's been asked about the Houston Rockets, he has not shut down those rumors. He has said that he's focused on playing with the Sixers this season. He's focused on the team that he's currently on, but he has never said, I will not be playing for the Houston Rockets next year. And with $64.17 million, the hiring of a fantastic coach in Ime Udoka, who really knows how to build a good team defense and understands how star players need to be the guys with the ball in their hands a lot of time, James Harden makes a lot of sense as an organizer, a distributor. Kevin Porter Jr. moves to a bench role, which I think would be really good for his career. I think Jalen Green is ready for takeoff. I think Jabari Smith would take a massive jump forward playing alongside James Harden. Plus, if they add Wembanyama and or Brandon Miller, they're in a spot where they're going to be very, very, very dangerous moving forward. Plus, they have cap space to add more veterans, more key contributors. They could add another wing. They could add a few bigs, which I know that they want to do. The Rockets are in a very, very commanding position going forward. Plus, they still have all of the Brooklyn Nets picks basically moving forward. So Houston, in a crazy turn of events, in my opinion, lands James Harden again. Harden returns to the franchise where he really broke out as a superstar in this league. And I think he'll ultimately finish his career there as well as a member of the Houston Rockets and as their starting point guard next season. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed this video. Comment who you would want your team to sign with your cap space or your exceptions, whether that's a mid-level exception, biannual exception, that's minimum exception. There's a lot of different ways for your team to go out and make some moves, even if they're in purgatory. Like the Washington Wizards, they can always go out and sign some guys using some type of NBA exception. Hopefully you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel for more, turn on that notification bell so you don't miss out on any more of the content here. And until next time, we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.